Our next speaker is Dr. Pantziarka, who is the Program Director for Drug Repurposing at the Anticancer Fund and a coordinator of Repurposing Drugs in Oncology, REDO project. He's also a co-founder of and chairman of the George Pantziarka TP53 Trust, which is a UK-based patient advocacy organization for sufferers of LFS, a rare inherited disorder that increases the risk of developing certain cancers. Dr. Pantziarka gives extensive time to support repurposing of drugs for EHE and is here to talk more about that today. Welcome.
Thank you, David. I'm not sure. Let me share my screen. I'm assuming people can hear me.
Your audio is coming through great. I will let you know when your slides are showing.
All right, great. Apologies, it seems to. Okay.
Your slides are now showing.
Great. So thank you for the organisers for asking me to do this. It's a great pleasure. And actually, having listened to Dr. Babati's previous talk just now, drug repurposing seems to be on the agenda there as well. So let me talk a little bit about what repurposing is and why it's interesting for people with EHE. For those that don't know, repurposing is a way of developing drug treatments for diseases. And instead of starting with a new molecule that's never been used in people before, we pick up existing licensed drugs. So in theory, this is a quicker way to develop treatments. And the advantages of this is that we already know about the safety of the drugs. We know what doses to use and we know how tolerable they are for patients. We have data about the mechanisms of action. So we have some idea of what these drugs do and how they're absorbed in the body and how they get to the organs that we're interested. Because they're existing drugs, many of them are at lower cost than newly developed drugs. We've all heard about the incredibly high cost of newly developed drugs. Well, a lot of the older drugs are far cheaper. All of these things together means that in terms of clinical trials and studies, we can very often skip those early phase trials. We don't have to show that the drug can hit the places we want to hit, or that the drug is safe for people to take. So this, in theory, means that we have a head start compared to newly developed molecules. But of course, this doesn't mean that the bar is any different to that we have to meet in terms of how effective the treatment is. So even though it's an old drug, which may be incredibly effective in its original disease, we still have to show that it's going to be effective in treating the new disease that we're interested in. A little bit more about the terminology. Repurposing, we like to differentiate between hard repurposing and soft repurposing. So if you take a drug that's already used in one cancer and use it in a different cancer, you find that it's relatively straightforward. The oncologists are already familiar with the drug. So there's a head start in terms of that type of repurposing. But if you're going to take a drug that isn't a cancer drug, a drug that maybe treats an infectious disease, or it may treat high blood pressure, and try and use that to treat the cancer, then that's a harder jump to make, and so we call that hard repurposing, because it's actually got a few more challenges. So essentially, soft repurposing is what the industry already does. I mean, when a new drug comes on the market to treat one cancer, the companies are really focused on getting additional approvals for other cancers, or they'll want to take a drug that's approved for second-line treatment and use it in first line. When we look for the hard repurposing cases, there are actually not that many that we can draw on as successful. Thalidomide is a drug that is notorious because of its prehistory, but that was eventually repurposed to treat multiple myeloma. Transretinoic acid, which was a drug for acne, now is used to treat a form of leukemia. And not on this slide, but a very recent one, there is a drug called DFMO, which is used to treat a tropical disease, has now recently been approved by the FDA to treat neuroblastoma, so a pediatric cancer that's quite deadly. So there are some examples. One question that often comes up is, well, if the drug is already approved, can't we use the drug off-label? Can't doctors just prescribe this to patients directly? Why do we need to go to clinical trials? Why do we have to do all of that? Why can't we just have it prescribed? And in some situations, that actually can be the right solution. So if you've got an ultra rare disease that only has one treatment center, and all of the doctors there are happy to treat the patients with that drug, and they're all convinced that the drug is safe and effective, then off-label use might be the right answer. But that's not really the optimum as far as we're concerned, because drugs are used off-label. You're depending on the doctor doing the prescribing, taking a risk, because they have greater liability, because they're using a drug to treat a patient, and that drug has not been approved for that disease. So the doctor risks being sued by the family if something goes wrong, and that has happened. But there's other downsides as well, because of that dependence on individual physicians, you don't have equal access. So some patients may be treated in a center where they are very comfortable with off-label use, but other patients will be in centers where they're not happy. So you have this unequal access to the drug, and we also risk a situation where if the drug disappears from the market for its original use, then it's going to disappear for the off-label use. So there are some downsides to off-label use. So it's not the ideal solution. So for us working in repurposing, what we want is for the drugs to be used on label. And once a drug is on label, then all patients with that disease should have access to that treatment. And for us, we're not interested in having a new license because there's a chance to make a profit or anything. What happens when a drug is granted an approval for a disease is the clinical guidelines change to include the new drug because it's now on label. Insurers and national payers will then agree to prescribe the drug. You're no longer dependent on individual doctors taking a risk and prescribing. And importantly, we also start to learn about what happens in the real world, because there's always a big difference between what happens in a clinical trial and what happens in the real world once a drug is approved. And so with off-label use, there's always the question of how do we learn what works, and also importantly, what doesn't work. Having the drug put on label gives us the opportunity to kind of use pharmacovigilance and other tools to kind of figure out really what is working and what doesn't work. Repurposing is especially interesting for rare cancers. Obviously, rare cancers, you have small patient numbers, and very often the pharma companies are just not focused on rare diseases. They're much more interested, for obvious reasons, in tackling the more common cancers. Rare diseases are often very heterogeneous. For some of the rare cancers, there are no molecular targets. EHE is actually quite lucky in that there is a unique target, but for many rare cancers, that's not the case. Often in rare cancers, especially when there are no good treatments, doctors will have already been using drugs off-label, so we can learn from the existing experience. So we can look at case reports and case studies, and from those build a hypothesis and try and take drugs through the whole development process. And of course, for rare cancers, there are these incredibly urgent unmet medical needs. And so repurposing as a strategy gives us a pool of drugs that are easier to move into clinical trial. So some really strong advantages for looking at repurposing in rare cancers. And what we found in recent years is that all of the main medical regulators, the FDA, the MHRA in the UK, and the EMA in Europe, are now incredibly interested in following repurposing. I mean, I've been doing this for a long time, and when we started working on repurposing drugs in oncology, all of the doors were closed, and I'm happy to say that in recent years the doors are open, and we've got a seat at the table. And so one outcome that I will be talking about is in Europe at the EMA, there was a call for pilot projects, and the Anticancer Fund worked with Silvia Stacchiotti to develop a proposal for EHE, which we submitted and was one of the projects that was selected, which was a great step forward, we think. So why are the regulators and the politicians increasingly interested in repurposing? Well, they are focused on three key areas: access to treatments, access to medicines. They're interested in the availability of medicines, especially after their experience during the COVID era, and they're interested in affordability, especially as many of the newer drugs are prohibitive in terms of their costs, even in high-income countries in Europe and the rest of the world. But from a patient and clinician perspective, the key issues are slightly different. We're interested in evidence, regulation, and incentives. For evidence, we need to show that the repurposed drug is effective. So how do we do this, especially in rare diseases where the normal phase 3 large randomized clinical trial is just not feasible? we need to know on the regulation side, what pathways are available. The normal commercial pathways, especially for ultra-rare diseases, are just not the same. So we need to know, how can we take the evidence that we generate when we do generate it and take it through. And we need to find incentives to make this interesting, because pharma is still in the driving seat for many of these processes. So they're our key issues in repurposing. So for EHE, what's the impact of these issues? So talking about our pilot project for EHE, one of the reasons the project was successful, we believe, is that you have a disease here where for metastatic disease, there's no active compound currently available. Lots of off-label uses of different things. And the only drugs which are approved are things like doxorubicin, classical chemotherapy drugs, which are just not active in patients. And the drug that those that are used off-label, the one that was most interesting is sirolimus. Now we know that a randomized clinical trial is not really feasible. There are low patient numbers. There's already off-label use of sirolimus, and there are no commercial sponsors. So no company is willing to invest in this. There's good data from case series, and there's registry data collection going on. So, and the other thing is that there's also a consensus paper from experts, and the ESMO guidelines as well mention sirolimus. So there's a good package of data and a good argument for why this drug should be repurposed for EHE. So the scenario that we've taken to the EMA is the unmet medical need. We have a drug with a mechanism of action and some data from off-label use, and some a scientific rationale. And we took this with EHE patient advocates, clinicians from the ERTC and the Anticancer Fund as well. So that's the case we've been making to the EMA for the repurposing of this drug. But what's missing from that list of participants is the drug company. And this is a key issue, that under the current legislation, you need a drug company to apply for a new license. And that's the same in the US, in the UK, and in Europe, in the European Union. Now we know how important this drug is to EHE patients. There was a survey that showed that for the vast majority of patients, it was either hugely important or very important to have sirolimus available to EHE patients. And for those patients who had taken the drug, we can see that the vast, a big majority there show that, in their opinion, they've had clear clinical benefit. So, this adds to the case for the repurposing, in addition to the case reports that we've had and the consensus paper. So that's an ongoing process, but repurposing promises to bring other candidates, not just sirolimus. One of the ones that we think is interesting is a drug called propranolol, which is a beta blocker. It's initially developed for hypertension and then heart arrhythmias. It's used for prophylaxis against migraines. A huge number, about 20 different approved uses now. And one of the last ones to be added was for the treatment of infantile hemangioma, which is a benign vascular tumor, but it actually can cause some real health problems. And based on that, when people tried to figure out why it was effective in infantile hemangioma, it was tested against a range of different vascular tumors, some of them malignant, including angiosarcoma and EHE. And it was shown in the lab that propranolol is effective against EHE cell lines. And we now have some case reports as well, where individuals with EHE have had responses to propranolol. There's currently a number of clinical trials ongoing in angiosarcoma. So taking this antihypertensive drug and using it to treat cancer, at least in clinical trials, is not that unusual now. And we do know from the angiosarcoma community that there are an increasing number of patients who are being treated off-label for this. So there's a good, strong rationale for exploring this in future in EHE. But as we saw from Dr. Purbabati's talk earlier, dinaciclib, also a repurposing candidate, looks interesting, and we expect that there will be other candidates emerging from biological studies that are ongoing. So we think repurposing for EHE is a strategy that is not going to stop at sirolimus, but will continue. So finally, we talked about wanting to get these drugs, once we've got data, we want them on label. So what do we need to do to succeed? We need changes in policy and regulation. I mean, I said our sticking point with the EMA is that there is no company currently involved, and without that we can't make progress. But there's legislation being discussed at the moment in the European Union, which will change that, in which case the data that we've got, we will be able to take and seek the repurposing of sirolimus without having a company on board. In the UK, we have an NHS Medicines repurposing program, which is taking a slightly different track, but has already approved one drug without a company leading the charge. So there are moves afoot to improve things. We need stronger clinical data that can be from observational studies, registries, possibly prospective trials in the future. But we also need the medical regulators to accept that there are challenges for ultra-rare diseases. And again, this is a huge topic that we are following up with the EHE advocates and clinicians with the EMA. So it's an ongoing story. We need stronger biological data. We need better animal models. We need tissue collection, biomarker research, and so on. Some of these drugs may be effective, but they may be effective in specific groups of patients. We need to be able to have biomarkers to identify who are the patients who are going to benefit from sirolimus, who are the patients who are not. And we need the stronger patient voice. All of the regulators, and we deal with the regulators all the time now, they're interested in listening to patients. Surveys, perspectives, we need to develop patient-reported outcomes which are specific to diseases like EHE rather than relying on generic instruments. So all of these are about the patient voice becoming louder and clearer in support of this. And we need much more collaboration. All of these programs depend on clinicians, researchers, patients, and happily, there again, we have something to report. There is a platform being developed called PUSH, which stands for Pushing Ultra Rare Sarcomas Towards Hope. And within that, there are different groups working on specific projects, and one of those is an EHE group. So watch this space. And thank you for listening.
Thank you. One question, it looks like Europe is having a bit more flexibility and being more progressive about processes. Can you comment briefly on what the situation looks like with the US FDA?
Yeah, the US FDA actually has a seat at the table in some of our interactions with the EMA. So they are aware of what's going on and are observing. There are programs at the FDA. So there's a program called Project Renewal, for example, which is looking at some of the older anti-cancer drugs and looking at what's on the label and what's actually being used. And the idea there is that the FDA will lead the label change, but they're starting with the older drugs. But the FDA is really paying attention. So I would expect that as the UK and the EMA are making changes, that changes will follow at the FDA as well.
Oh, that's excellent to hear. Well, thank you so much for your time today.